Explorers, adventurers, scientists. The ones who always broadened our horizons. We were at their side when they reached the deepest point in the oceans, the highest summits of the Earth, and both poles. We may think we've seen it all, that the world has its limits after all. But why do explorers, adventurers, scientists continue to venture out there again and again? Certainly not just for the record. So what do they seek, really? To understand more intimately how complex and delicate our planet is, to document its change and how we can affect it for the better. As long as they need it, we will be at their side. Because today, the real discovery is not so much about finding new lands, it's about looking with new eyes at the marvels of our planet, rekindling our sense of wonder and acting here and now to preserve this pale blue dot and make it perpetual.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Trevor Wallace, and I'm the Vice President of Research and Education at the club. But I also wear a different hat, which you may have noticed during this week, is I'm a documentary filmmaker. And it's been my honor to follow along this incredible group of women capturing a documentary about their work for the past few years. And I think if you have been able to talk to any of these incredible marine biologists, Callie Wielenturf, Carla Barrientos Munoz, Wigidili Crespo, and Liz Rios, it has changed you, and it changed me. And it felt like if we could share just one tiny bit of the way it's like to experience being with them or being out in the field with them, we could change the world. Standing next to me is my amazing co-director, Nikki Riddy, who is the head of Impact Media at the Leatherback Project. She's the unsung hero of this project, and she's going to tell you a little bit more.
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all. My name is Nikki Riddy. I'm a photographer and filmmaker, and I've had the honor of documenting the Leatherback Project's work with Callie and the team over the last 2 years. So we're really excited to preview a teaser for our documentary called Sisters of the Sea with you for the first time publicly, and then soon for the rest of the world. So enjoy.
Has been coming to this beach for millions of years to lay her eggs. Unfortunately now, due to the threats caused by humans, the nesting habitat appears to be no longer viable, at least in some parts of the beach.
Las tortugas, las baulas, son nuestros antepasados, la hermana perdida en el mar. Que es importante protegerlos, porque si no lo hacemos, ¿quién lo va a hacer?
This is the moment. We're fast losing the chance.
I just see the potential of what it would look like to live in harmony with nature. I really want to use my life in that way.
Jungle known as the Darien Gap, safe haven for criminal organizations and bandits.
La unidad de Defensa Nacional de Fronteras está entrenada para mitigar esa amenaza que se dé.
There is a contrast between what people think the work is versus what it is. Going into the field in remote places, not having safety nets. A first sea turtle conservation project here that will use tags of any capacity. We really want to know if the turtles are moving in between Panama and Colombia. There is port development. We need to know what threat they pose to these sea turtles. The groups that are developing the ports, they're very dangerous. My friend had a friend murdered for speaking out on their negative impact on local communities.
Siendo la primera bióloga marina de Armilla y trabajando en Armilla, ya estoy cumpliendo mi sueño.
Tienes un chance aquí inspirar a los niños que siguen tus pasos ahora.
Realmente siempre quise ser bióloga. Es algo impresionante como el universo me lleva a todo esto.
yours. Tortuga Armila está en Colombia. Qué emoción. Ahora vamos a marcar 4 más.
Sí.
Now is a time for drastic change. If we aren't inconvenienced, we are not doing enough. It's time that we advocate for the rights of nature within a legal setting around the world, and that we don't stop there.
Thank you so much to the club for allowing us to share that trailer with you briefly, and thank you so much to you both for bringing it to life, for sticking it out in the field with us for so many months on end just to document what we do. And in that vein, I have a really special prize, if you will, that I would like to give to Nikki Riddy. She's, like she mentioned, our director of impact media for the organization, and she is the unsung hero. She's always behind the camera documenting all of our work with the sea turtles in the different countries that we work in, and she's not able to be recognized. And so I want to take this opportunity to thank her publicly for everything that she does to make our work possible, to make us be able to have impact, to make us be able to show you what we do with photos and videos. It wouldn't be possible without her. So thank you. This is a wave, a blown glass wave, which I think is really indicative of your contribution to World Oceans Week this year and to the waves of change that you're making, not just for our organization, but for the ocean. Thanks, Nikki.
Good afternoon. If I get Mark and Julie and Constance. So I think by this time most have seen me once or twice, maybe too much. Ted Janulis, great to see everybody. And this is kind of the end of quite a week. And we were thinking about how to close it out, but the biggest thing is a huge set of thank yous, really, because as you can imagine, from all the things that happened during the week, it's an enormous amount of work, and planning for next year basically starts Monday morning, if not Sunday. So this crowd over here, I want to call out specifically, and you've seen them because they've been interwoven throughout the week, but Julian Alex Wallace and Mark Bryant Brown and Constance Tafidi have been absolutely unbelievable. So. And you see, we kind of break it up. It's like a week. So each of these events is like a big event in and of itself. So Constance was on Monday, and Alex was last night. Alex and Julie together do sustainable seafood. Mark did the whole, well, actually 2 different things. He did the Plastic Innovation Prize with Tom Ford, and then again yesterday with the students getting out in the world. So, and that's just the beginning of it. There's because all these other things go on. So. That require all this work. So in addition to that, we have, I think it's 40 plus people at this point who are volunteering, and that's the people who are here during the week in the blue t-shirts, but it's also people like basically working all year long as well on different elements of it. And then as we said, you can't say in a few words what the staff is, what they're like, because Kevin, you see running around with all the head sites. You see Will Roseman dashing in and out. You see incredible work by Lacey curating all the spaces. Jenna doing all the curation of the events, and Tim and Felix. It's an incredible team. Even Brittany, who's on maternity leave, is doing amazing things as well. So hey, Pete. So before we turn it over to Katie to launch us into the Oyster Hour, I did want to go one more time through the sponsors, because it's one thing if you say, well, thanks to our sponsors, and then you say they are, but I just want to give you a little sense of how it ties together. So you've probably heard us thank Rolex many times over the course of the week, but in case you missed it, I mean, there would absolutely be no World Oceans Week without Rolex. The first year we did it, it was a total 3-point shot, a yo thing. We knew the UN was in town, so we we went along with that. And then the next year, they could have easily said, that was nice, we're not going to do it again. But they stuck with us, and they've been through it all the way through, increasing their sponsorship, helping us draw more people in, and always way in the background, never taking any spotlight for themselves, always reflecting it. And the same I would say with Schmidt Marine Technology Partners, and I don't think are Erica and Mark here, but it's become like family. First of all, they're both members, but they've gone from sort of being a sponsor to now. You saw, if you're here last night, you see they're actually mixing it up in the programs. Jodica is here now from Schmidt Ocean Institute. Last year, Erica brought all this tech stuff that we brought here and into the UN. So it's really become, it sort of is a category buster in terms of thinking about what sponsorship is. And then Phil Stevenson, the same thing. If they give grants to youth coming into the club, they sponsor this as its own entity, and then they come and they participate the whole week. Only one. On Sunday nights, we're thinking, if you really want to make this a week, we really should have a proper kickoff for out-of-town guests and speakers and things like that. So the reason it was a little bit homemade this week is we never did it before because we didn't have somebody to help us with it. And only one stepped up and said, just do it. So we had our first of what I think now will be a tradition of, it won't always be the exact same day of the week, et cetera, but evening kickoff, whoever does that in the future. Then Lonely Whale and Tom Ford. We've known Lonely Whale since for all 8 years now, and they brought that opportunity to us to work with Tom Ford and to Estee Lauder and themselves. So that was a long-term relationship that turned into a pretty special event out of whole cloth. And then for our Blue Gens, which you've heard a lot about, Sustainable Ocean Alliance, One Ocean Foundation, and Rockwool all stepped up with very little information and agreed to host somebody, an early emerging ocean steward. And that's how we ended up with people from PNG and Egypt here because of that generosity. And then just so we don't spend too much time on the auction, which I encourage you to look at, but Lindblad, Panan, Adventure Canada, Sandals, and Variety Cruises all stepped up. And they could have easily said, you've already got something, we're not going to do it. But they all have been incredibly generous. So we're appreciative to that because that's a lot of the economics for us to try to fund the club's programs. Then all the seafood providers, as you heard, they all come at their own expense. They all donate their time. They donate their products. And as usual, that was so much fun. And Alex and Julia really made that a tent pole of the whole thing. And then on the partner side, Billy and Oyster Project, same thing. It's like we call up Pete and say, hey, want to do this together? And Pete's like, sure, let's go. And here we are. And it's been wonderful. They've already, well, actually, Katie's going to talk about that. So she's not. I'm just going to say big, huge thank you to Pete Malinowski and to Billy and Oyster because I think Katie probably will mention that. But they've been incredibly generous with Blue Gen and this event that we're about to have after we talk now. And the last group I want to thank is the audience because, as you know, there's that expression, the people make the party. And all the people who are here this week, the level of engagement of coming to the presentations, being there consistently, staying around afterwards, talking to people they didn't know, it really sets a tone for this event that's pretty remarkable. So a huge thank you to the people who came and joined, and have already come up with us, here's ideas for next year, what about this, what about that, what can we do? And that's the kind of community we really want to be building over the long term. So I will ask the four of you, or the other chairs, is there anybody I'm missing? Because I always feel terrible when I miss anybody. Sounds like we're good. And needless to say, Will and Richard Garriott and the whole board have been incredibly supportive from the get-go in this as well. So, it's really a social license to operate kind of thing. You really want to make sure that you have, buy-in from the central part of the club, and whether it's the staff or executive management or the board, we've never felt anything other than hugely supported. So thank you to everybody. Thank you to the audience. And now I was about to introduce her. Sorry about that. And that's all. See you later. Katie, who you're about to hear from, has done a miraculous job on oysters, and I wanted to keep it for your introduction. But Katie has, she's been chair of our ECAD dinners, annual dinners, twice. She's been a regular participant in World Oceans Week, and she basically worked on this oyster relationship, both from the perspective of the panel that you're about to see, which is very, very cool, but also the larger construct, the relationship of Billy and Oyster Project, which we hope this is the first step of a long, engaged and beautiful relationship. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Katie.
When Ted invited me to help out with World Oceans Week, I wasn't prepared for how obsessed I'd become with oysters. But that's exactly what happened to me, and my guess is that's what's about to happen to you all. As New Yorkers, we love to think of ourselves as tough and hardworking and resilient, but oysters are the OGs. They are the real deal. Case in point, one oyster can clean 50 gallons of water a day. They make dead water livable again. To put this in perspective, this Monday, a humpback was seen next to the Statue of Liberty. And these days, thanks to the oysters and people in this room, this is not a rare occurrence. Oysters give us hope. It's been an honor to learn from this group of visionaries, conservationists, educators, scientists, and self-described oyster nerds. The folks in front of you are doing the hard work. They're rewilding the least wild place on Earth. They are raising the next generation of conservationists, even here in New York City, giving them a direct connection to nature in a place where access is highly limited or fenced off completely. They stand shoulder to shoulder with the oyster farmers who are on the front lines of climate breakdown, and they are leading some of the most ambitious and impactful conservation projects in the country. My hope is that after today, everyone here discovers for themselves that oysters, often overlooked as appetizers, are also overlooked heroes of conservation. But being here today really changes that. It's a privilege to introduce our moderator, Julie Chu. Julie is the co-founder of the Oyster Master Guild and creator of her blog In a Half Shell, an educational platform that empowers consumers to create better oyster experiences. All right, Julie.
Katie. So I'm going to start the panel off by calling up the panelists. Here we have Pete Malinowski, who is the Executive Director of Billion Oyster Project. Pete. And Dr. Steve Davis, who is the Chief Science Officer for the Everglades Foundation. And then Sally McGee, who is the Sustainability, what is your, apologies, Director of Climate for Global Aquaculture Team for the Nature Conservancy. Apologies. I know you as Shellfish Growers Climate Coalition. We have a wonderful, amazing panel. Can I get to my slides, please? There we go. So as Katie just mentioned, actually, before I even begin, can everybody just raise your hands if you even like eating oysters? Perfect. You guys, you're in the right place. How about raise of hand if you are already aware of the ecosystem benefits that oysters have? A little bit. Okay, a pretty well-rounded group. We are really going to get into it then and be really specific about kind of the work that is happening in New York City and also around the world. So here we have a picture of some wild oysters, actually these oyster clusters, not things that you typically don't see in the raw bars today. Right now in the raw bars, we like to enjoy oysters on the half shell. They're farmed oysters. But in the wild, this is what oysters look like. Right? They grow in clusters, they grow in reefs, and they are amazing creatures in the water. Right now, we in North America are still really lucky to have some really wonderful wild oyster reef habitats and alongside farmed oysters. But again, with climate and developed coastal areas, it's a battle to keep them in place. So one of the amazing projects that is really close to home right here in New York City is Billion Oyster Project. And the picture actually behind this logo is of the oyster shells that are being cured. It kind of reminds me of historic oyster middens, where you see these piles of oyster shell and clamshell kind of maybe like 100 feet tall in places like in Maine, in Florida, where they were remnants of indigenous people eating shellfish and then just sort of discarding the shells in a pile. Not exactly sure why they decided to do that instead of just throwing them back in the water, but it's right there, and it is a testament to the fact that we've always loved oysters. We've loved them, having them, and they were important to our diet. So it's really one of the few foods that we still eat that hasn't changed for thousands of years. And that's just kind of incredible to think about. Now, going into BOP, besides being a delicious and nutritious source of sustenance for us, oysters really do play an important role in our marine ecosystem. So Pete, I would love for you to start off by telling everybody about the significance of oyster reefs in the marine ecosystems, particularly what role do they play and the benefits that they provide.
All right. Thank you all so much for having me. Thank you, Julie. Thanks, Steve and Sally. So cool to be back at the Explorers Club. Really appreciate it. Oysters. So, I think it's important to remember that where we're sitting used to be one of the great ecosystems of the world. So New York City is a center of life, a center of bioproductivity for the entire Western North Atlantic, and as one of the world's great estuaries, produced all kinds of fish life and all of these important animals into the ocean and here as well. And when colonists first arrived in New York City, they described being able to catch fish just by lowering a basket over the side of the boat and hauling it back up, and not being able to see the sky for minutes at a time because there are so many birds. And I just say that because I think it's important to remember that we're in a place that used to be completely full of animals on a scale that doesn't exist anywhere on Earth anymore, right? And that the oyster reefs were an integral part of that bioproductivity. And oyster reefs, you can think of oysters just like the trees in a forest or the grass in a salt marsh. Without the oysters, there's no oyster reef ecosystem. Without the trees, there is no forest. And so the oyster reefs in the bottom of New York Harbor used to filter the water, provide food and habitat for hundreds of other species, stabilize the bottom, and protect the shores and other important habitat types. So we call them ecosystem engineers, a keystone species. When we removed all the oysters, we kind of cut that ecosystem off at the knees. And the harbor in New York City really lost a lot of that productivity. And then, of course, the harbor got super polluted and really gross for a long time. And it's just now getting better. And it's super exciting to be doing this work now in New York Harbor because every day there are more animals in the harbor. And every day the water quality is better than it was the day before, or every year it's better than it was the year before. And it's just been really cool over the last 15 years watching all of these animals come back to New York Harbor.
Thank you. So going into what has BOP done to help this along, and what is the goal ultimately for the project?
Right. So our goal, see if you can guess, we're trying to restore 1 billion oysters to New York Harbor. But more than that, we want everyone in New York City to be excited about restoring 1 billion oysters to New York Harbor. And so we've designed Billion Oyster Project to involve as many different types of people as possible. So we have educational programs in schools where we design curriculum and train teachers to teach their math and science lessons through the lens of oyster restoration. We have volunteer programs, community reefs, small reef installations at places in New York City where you can walk down into the water. We have volunteer days on Governor's Island and around New York City. We want everyone in New York City to feel excited about the harbor and to feel like it belongs to all of us. We all have the right to access a clean and abundant harbor, and we all have a responsibility to take care of it. And what we're doing at Billion Oyster Project, the charge that we're leading is to restore 1 billion live oysters onto oyster reefs throughout the harbor. So far, we've restored about 130 million oysters, which means we only have about 870 million to go before we get to 1 billion, but we're well on our way. And we've also engaged 100,000 New Yorkers in that work. So over the last 10 or so years, 100,000 people, New Yorkers, have participated directly in restoring oysters to New York Harbor. And our ultimate goal is to get 1 million people restoring 1 billion oysters. So we're working to a point where we can restore 100 million oysters per year and engage 100,000 people per year, because we believe that if 1 in 10 New Yorkers participate directly in restoring New York Harbor, then through that effort, we'll build awareness and affinity for the resource and change the relationship that the city has with the natural world around us, and prove that one of the biggest cities in the world can live in a supportive way with the natural ecosystem around us. And we don't have to leave New York City to find nature, but we can actually find, see, and touch natural things right here in the city.
That's amazing. And do you find that surely people seem convinced that they would like to do this work, but is there anything else that you tell them, tell volunteers why it's really important to bring oysters back to such an urban place like New York?
Well, it creates a really cool opportunity because it's illegal to harvest oysters from New York City. The water's too polluted to eat the oysters. They would make you sick. And so in some ways it sort of is like a marine sanctuary. It's polluted and urbanized, and it's not what you think of as a sanctuary environment. But because you can't harvest the oysters, you have an opportunity to restore that habitat in a place where it won't be disturbed. And so you can create, rewild an area that's surrounded by 30 million people. And those opportunities don't really exist in many places. But estuaries, like New York Harbor, are all over the world, and many of them used to have thriving oyster populations. The story of oysters in New York City is the same as 22 of the largest 30 cities on the face of the earth, that are built on estuaries that used to have thriving oyster populations, right? This is a very common tale in big cities. So if we can do this in New York, if we can prove that we can make this change here in New York City, it's a model that can exist in any of those places. And we could have, imagine how cool that would be. If you could walk down the Hudson River and just see whales swimming by and, wading birds and all of that stuff. So that's what we're working for. And I know for sure that if everyone in New York City, I get to spend a lot of time on New York Harbor. It's a really sweet perk of my job. And these guys, my kids, also get to spend a lot of time on boats in the harbor, which they're usually sometimes excited about. But but I know for sure that if everyone in New York City knew New York Harbor like I know New York Harbor, we'd stop polluting New York Harbor immediately. And so the question is, how do you build that awareness with everybody? So I want everyone in New York City to be as excited about New York Harbor as I am.
Now, I know that you sent in some slides that kind of depict what the work is, and I would love to show people really what that work entails, because it's both, we can say we restore, but it's a lot of logistics too, right?
It's also very fun. So this is a New York Harbor School vessel. So we are based at the New York Harbor School. I used to teach at Harbor School. Harbor School trains teenagers to drive boats, scuba dive, conduct research, engineer reef systems, advocate, and change policy. And these students play an integral role in Billion Oyster Project. So you see students here on the boat putting oysters into the water. This is right by JFK Airport, and going through and monitoring the oysters here. We basically have 3 core programs. Restoration, where we're building oyster reefs. Education is our work with schools, both at the New York Harbor School and schools throughout New York City, trying to change what teaching and learning looks like by training teachers to teach differently. And community engagement. So those are our small reefs. Those are our, work with communities at field stations throughout the shoreline of New York City, where we can get people in the water helping to build and monitor oyster reefs. We talk a lot about getting your feet wet and your hands dirty, and actually holding wild animals, which for many young people in New York City is a very new experience, to hold a seahorse that they found in their oyster cage, right, which is now becoming sort of a regular occurrence in the harbor. And so that just sort of breaking the land-water barrier and holding live animals can be super exciting.
So I have a kind of a technical question for you, because when you are restoring oysters, you essentially have to settle the baby oysters on existing oyster shells, hence why you collect oyster shells from restaurants. Now, I know that this endeavor can be complicated and expensive. Have you explored in your early days, or even now, other ways to put more oysters in the water, or have different substrates that they can live on?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so oysters spend part of their lives swimming around as larvae, and then they attach to a substrate and grow their shells. And they like attaching to oyster shells. They don't use the shell as a shell. They just use it as something to attach to. And what we do now is we import oyster larvae from commercial hatcheries and put them in tanks, giant tanks with all these different reef structures. And then once they've settled, we move the reef structures down to the bottom as an oyster reef. And that's, in much of the harbor, that's our primary strategy, because we need to build up the population of oysters. In some places, like up the Hudson River by the Tappan Zee Bridge, there are actually so many oysters in the system already that you don't need to seed reef structures. You could put a rock in the water and come back in a year and it would be totally covered with oysters. And so at those sites, what we're trying to do is bring that population south just by putting reef structures in the water. So we use oyster shell in these big wire boxes And we use reef balls, which are cement half domes that are like this big that sit on the bottom, and we'll put those in at certain sites, we'll put those in our tanks, cover them with live oysters, and at other sites, like up the Hudson River, we'll just put those on the bottom and make a sort of necklace of reefs coming down the river.
That's great. And for people who hear about this, they're like, this is awesome. I want to get involved. I want to volunteer. I want to contribute. I know that Billy and Oyster Party is your biggest fundraiser that happens every September, which is, by the way, it's like the best oyster party. So if you haven't been, you should definitely go. Besides that, what are other ways for everyday New Yorkers to get involved in this?
Great question. Something I should have included in my remarks. But go to our website, come out to Governor's Island. There's a bunch of different ways to get involved. We always need volunteers. We want every restaurant that serves oysters in New York City to give us their shells. So if you eat oysters, tell your restaurants to work with us on shell collection. If you're connected to young people in school, make sure their teachers are teaching about Billy and Oyster Project and participating in our programs. I think most importantly, tell your friends that New York Harbor is a place worth preserving and protecting, that a third of the wading birds on the east coast of North America spend some of their time in New York Harbor, that there are all of these cool animals here, and that there are teenagers working hard every day to clean up the mess we're making and restore oyster reefs to New York Harbor. And then go to the waterfront. Go down, if you have an afternoon, go walk along the East River or walk along the Hudson River, or go to any of half a dozen free kayaking programs you can do right here in New York City. There's a 22,000 acre national park that you can get to by a subway in Jamaica Bay. That's often full of dolphins, right? Go check it out. That's what I'd say.
Thank you. That's awesome. All right, we are going to switch gears and go all the way down to Florida, where we talk about the Everglades. So Steve, or Dr. Davis, can you tell us first about the mission of the Everglades Foundation and the nature of your work?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's a delight to be here and to participate with this panel, and got to go out on the boat today and just learned a lot about what Billy and Oyster Project is doing. And really our mission is similar in that it's about restoration of the Everglades, but also protection of the ecosystem into the future. So Everglades restoration is a $25 billion state-federal partnership, and it encompasses a massive area of South Florida, about 18,000 square miles. So the state agency that works with the Army Corps of Engineers at the federal level, they plan the projects, they construct these projects. We kind of keep them between the guardrails as a science-based organization. We do the modeling and the technical work to ensure, as sort of a watchdog organization, that they're designing and building these projects to deliver the environmental benefits that they were intended to.
Got it. And for those of us who haven't visited the Everglades, can you actually just paint a picture of what that environment is like beyond the sheer scale of it all?
Well, I think the next slide really speaks to the scale. The way the Everglades worked historically, the image on the left shows the historic river of grass. The headwaters originates in Orlando, 100 miles down the Kissimmee Valley to Lake Okeechobee. That's a 700 square mile lake that would spill over the southern rim and fan out as a river of grass over 100 miles in length. The slope of the landscape's about 2 inches for every mile you go south. So this is an incredibly large ecosystem. So the scale is important. It's rainfall driven. We get 5 feet of rainfall every year in South Florida. 75% of that comes in our wet season. That's a lot of water that this ecosystem would manage on its own. And we completely changed the flow and the quality of water across South Florida. We redirected water east and west, cut off the flow of water to the river of grass. And so the changes that have taken place have been pretty dramatic. In terms of the quality of water, we see increased algae blooms across South Florida, many of which are toxic. We exacerbate red tide on the Gulf of Mexico coast. The oysters and seagrasses in our estuaries are really the canaries in the coal mine in terms of how this redirection and quality of water has impacted our ecosystem. And then to the south, places like Florida Bay and the Florida Keys, where we're not getting enough fresh water, those estuaries are really dying because they're too salty. In some cases, we see salinity levels about double that of seawater. And so these problems are all connected to the way we've rerouted water and the way we've polluted the system.
Now, I know that any oyster lover probably recognizes the name Apalachicola as Florida's most iconic oyster, but it sounds like in the Everglades, these oysters serve a different purpose, or they're just more valued doing other things. Has this always been the case, and do you see it changing in the future?
Well, you're right. There are places where oysters in Florida are an important commercial product, but in South Florida, it's really, they're valued for their ecosystem services, but also as indicators of the health of the quality of water. We know that these are really champions in terms of cleaning up our waterways. But in the past, there were cultures that really relied on shellfish as a source of food. You mentioned the middens. We have some islands in South Florida that were created by the accumulation of oyster shell over multiple generations. And some of these mounds are tens of feet high, over 100 feet in width, just massive areas where these shells have accumulated over generations.
So maybe another oyster city in the future?
Potentially.
Now, earlier this spring, the governor of Florida announced a commitment of $1.5 billion towards Everglades restoration and water quality improvements. Can you speak to the significance of this investment and impact?
Well, first of all, people might wonder why that kind of investment is important. And I'm sure many of you have been to Florida. You know that we're valued because of our beautiful waterways and beaches, and our waterways are all connected in South Florida, and any governor that understands the value of tourism to that state is going to see the need to continually invest in that to maintain it. So it really is an investment in our economy. It's an investment in our future. The $1.5 billion, it really is an essential level of funding needed over a decade or more to get these projects built. One of the key projects that we're building now, it's a reservoir about the size of Manhattan in terms of footprint. It's a $3.5 billion project that will allow us to store, treat, and flow over 110 billion gallons of water from Lake Okeechobee back to the Everglades. And so that level of investment is really needed to keep us on track.
I'm going to go through a couple other slides that you have here.
So this just speaks to what Everglades restoration is about. It is different from sort of the biological restoration efforts of Billion Oyster Project. These are large water infrastructure projects that, because we've lost half of the Everglades, because we've redirected water, we need large storage reservoirs to take that water, store it, allow us to cleanse it through massive wetlands that, like oysters, the power of wetlands are very similar in that they cleanse water so that then we can flow that water back to the Everglades. Conveyance is a big part of it as well. We're completely rebuilding a 10-mile stretch of Tamiami Trail, 3.3 miles of bridges to get more water across the finish line into Everglades National Park. That's the goal of restoration. So this is really restoration in a nutshell. Education is a big part of what we do as well at the Everglades Foundation. We have a K-12 literacy program. We try to engage kids. We have a champion school program. We're in more than 25 school districts. We've trained 7,000 teachers across the state, reached about 250,000 students. At some of these champion schools, you can see kids are actually working with oysters and understanding the value of them. And we also partner with a number of different organizations. As a foundation, we support groups like Florida Oceanographic and their oyster restoration efforts, similar to what you all are doing here in the St. Lucie Estuary, engaging communities. Here you see some of the oyster bags, and the young kid there, he's got a bucket of larvae, and he's trying to get some of that to settle in these areas so those reefs can be reestablished.
Now, I know I've been on your website, and you do talk quite a bit about carbon sequestration. I was curious to know, in your opinion, are oysters relatively effective carbon sequesters compared to other things in the environment?
Well, the Everglades itself is a massive carbon sponge. It's a subtropical peatland. And when you consider the scale of this ecosystem, about 3 million acres, it has the ability to sequester enormous amounts of carbon, especially with a year-round growing season that we have. Oysters themselves, it's a bit of a paradox because they produce shell material, and the precipitation of that calcium carbonate that goes into the shell actually releases a little bit of carbon dioxide. So they're, depending on the reef type, some are absolutely sequestering carbon, but they're generally the more subtidal, deeper water systems. But yes, they can absolutely sequester carbon at scale.
Thank you. I think we have one more slide there that you...
Yeah, this just speaks to sort of the big water management system in South Florida. And if you go from the Everglades in the interior of the peninsula to the coast, we've got 2,000 miles of canals, 2,000 miles of levees, hundreds of pump structures in South Florida. But it's all connected to the Everglades ecosystem and our water supply. I live in Miami-Dade County. My water was probably underneath the Everglades the week before. So when folks turn on the taps in South Florida, it's important to know that your water comes from the Everglades. So restoring the ecosystem helps to build resilience for South Florida in terms of our water supply, but also in terms of modernizing our flood control system.
And thinking back to the education efforts, how aware would you say are your typical Floridians about oyster benefits and the restoration that's happening?
Well, again, the oysters being a critical indicator of the health of our waterways, especially in those communities that are most affected by the discharges from Lake Okeechobee. They know all too well the impacts on oysters and the importance of restoring the flow of water so that we can get those ecosystems back to what they were.
Nice picture.
Yeah, this just shows the sort of tropical nature of oysters we have in South Florida, and barnacles encrusting on the prop roots of mangroves, and it's just it's a different flavor of oyster-based ecosystem that we have in South Florida.
Quite literally, this is a different species of oyster, right, that you have?
There are a few, but we also have the eastern oyster.
Yes. That's right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on. Sally, you're up next. This is a great picture that you gave to me, which I think is part of the first question. Can you please tell me about the Shellfish Growers Climate Coalition under the Nature Conservancy, what it is and what are its goals?
Yeah, sure. So this is a picture of Bill Mook and me a few years ago. So Bill owns a oyster company up in Damascotta, Maine. And I was introduced to Bill actually by Pete's mom. Pete's mom said, you really need to meet Bill because I think you've got some things that you need to talk about climate change. Bill is seeing some big impacts on his farm up in Maine, and he's really concerned about it. So I was working for the Nature Conservancy at the time. It was about 2016. I went to a shellfish meeting in Providence, saw Bill give a presentation. His first slide that he put up at this presentation, it was a scientific meeting about shellfish, was a picture of a globe on fire. And so this is a man who makes all of his decisions at his company based entirely on science. And for him to put a picture of a globe on fire said to me that he really was kind of at his wit's end about what to do and really wanting to raise the alarm about what he was seeing with his fellow shellfish farmers. So Bill and I sat down after his presentation about what he was seeing on his farm, the impacts of climate change, and I think both of us thought we'd chat for about 20 minutes We talked for about 2 hours, and about a few months later, in conversations with Bill and with Fisher's Island Oyster Farm, Pete's family, and a few others, we created the Shellfish Growers Climate Coalition. This was very much an idea that came from the shellfish farmers. It was not an idea that came from the Nature Conservancy. The shellfish farmers brought it to us. They were seeing impacts on their farms. We had relationships with the farmers because it was very much kind of transactional relationships, because we were buying shellfish from them for restoration projects that we were doing. So we knew them and were buying shellfish from them. And they wanted to do something, but they didn't have relationships on Capitol Hill, for example, to be able to say to members of Congress, hey, you need to take action on climate. And so we created the Shellfish Growers Climate Coalition. We had those 7 founding members, and starting in 2016, and now we have about 300 companies from all 3 coasts. About 75% of them are shellfish farms, and the rest are either restaurants or gear manufacturers or closely associated businesses. So for the first several years, we were focused really on federal policy. So there were a lot of really great opportunities that over the course of several years we were able to capitalize on. We took farmers down to Washington, D.C., and lobbied. Kind of people were really out of their comfort zone, but they went and lobbied Congress for on a number of climate issues several times, and really successfully. So we've shifted gears recently and are really more focused on what farmers can do themselves in terms of reducing their own carbon footprint. And communicating with their own communities on what farms are seeing with climate impacts. So anyway, I love that picture too. Bill's a great person, and he's a really no BS kind of person, and I love him a lot, and feel very fortunate to have met him. So thanks, Pete's mom, for introducing me.
Now, you must have also bonded over the fact that you are both oyster farmers, as you are a former oyster farmer yourself, yes, in Connecticut. And I am curious to know how your experience as an oyster farmer helped shape or change the way that you view marine environments.
Yeah, so let me just clarify. So I had an oyster farm. I started it from scratch. It was kind of a therapy exercise for me because I worked as a federal regulator of wild harvest fisheries for about 9 years, which was hazard duty in a lot of ways. It was so managing federal fisheries is all about saying no. Fish less, don't fish there, throw that fish overboard, whether it's alive or dead. I wouldn't do it again. But anyway, when I was done with that, I live in Mystic, Connecticut, and down the street there was this kind of mysterious building with people who were doing things I didn't know what they were doing. I kept asking questions, and this guy said, well, come, I'll show you what I'm doing. I'm growing oysters. And so finally he said, is this something that you would want to do? And I was like, oh, well, maybe, sure. And so I eventually started my own, very small, let me just say, very small by comparison to anything that Bill or Malinowski's are doing. But I did have a nugget of a business that I grew and have sold, and some others are carrying on, which makes me very happy. But it was fabulous to be able to get out on the water and be able to see and understand through all the seasons in a way that I wouldn't have otherwise, to really understand what was going on the water, and see even in over the course of just 7 years, just back to the topic of climate, how things are changing. And in the first few years, there, I had to think about ice, and in the places where I would sink my oysters in bags in the wintertime, I don't have to worry. The guys who have my company now, they don't have to worry about that anymore because it doesn't ice over. So I learned a lot.
Now, going back to the programs from the Nature Conservancy,
So I can change the slide too.
yes,
Oh yeah.
that's
So,
your.
yeah, so that is one poorly tended oyster on my farm, actually, that had another oyster growing on it, and the marsh in the background. That anyway, yeah.
Well, so in 2020, the Nature Conservancy launched the SOAR program, which stands for Supporting Oyster Aquaculture and Restoration, and it has continued to fuel great oyster restoration and education initiatives around the country. Can you tell us about one or two projects that speak the loudest to you?
Yeah. So I'll tell you about this. This is a farmer in New Hampshire, and he is throwing market-sized oysters overboard. So those are oysters that are the size of the ones that we will be eating soon. So he's throwing them overboard rather than bringing them on board. And so the SOAR project was started during the pandemic. This farmer, Brian, I'm not remembering Brian's last name, but he, like every other oyster farmer during the pandemic, immediately had zero market for their product, zero. So it was scary, it was awful. It was like an economic catastrophe instantly. Lights flashing. All right. So was that?
You can keep going.
Okay. So what we did early in the pandemic was these farmers had nowhere for their product to go. The oysters were getting bigger. They had no room on their farm. The Nature Conservancy said, all right, how about we buy some of these and put them on restoration sites? So we didn't, we weren't buying them for the same price that they would go at a restaurant, but we were at least buying some of them so that they wouldn't go to waste. And so what we did was we were buying oysters, putting them on restoration sites rather than having them go to waste. So we went to a private foundation, the Builders Initiative, who said, yes, great idea, go ahead, yes, let's do this, turned it around really quickly and started doing that. So we're currently in the second round of doing that, even though we're not in a pandemic. It was a very popular project for both the farmers, for the Nature Conservancy, for towns who loved this kind of idea, and we're continuing it. So Nature Conservancy is doing this, towns are doing the same kind of thing, states are doing it, USDA is doing it. We're actually working with the Farm Bill right now, trying to get some more language in the Farm Bill so that we can do even more of this. So we're not relying just on private foundation money to do this kind of thing. So in this picture, Brian is tossing market-sized oysters onto a restoration site. So.
And this is all doing things on the hill that you just mentioned as well.
Yeah. So the picture on the left just is kind of that's in Grand Isle, Louisiana, which is in very southern Louisiana, and one of the people who came with us several times to Capitol Hill has a farm in Grand Isle, and they were hit by Katrina, Laura. It was an I hurricane. No, not Irene. Not Ivan. Anyway, It was an I-1 in 2021, whatever the I-1 was in 2021. They just keep getting hit. So this was just a way to show what the kinds of things are and what the very real motivations are for people to leave their homes and put on a jacket and tie and go to Washington, D.C. in the summertime. The lobby.
Stepping out of their comfort zone, but for
Very
a really
much.
good cause. So, well, going back to when you were saying that you were going to continue the program with buying the oysters from the growers, and potentially that might have made them think differently about their business models in some ways. But in any case, how do you see the role of oyster farms and oyster farmers evolving in the context of climate change and increasing sustainable coastal development?
Well, it's changing a lot because there are so many kinds of impacts that they're experiencing. So they're having to do things like pack up and go to Washington, D.C. because they're getting, hurricane after hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico or in the Pacific Northwest, impacts like ocean acidification in the Gulf of Maine. All these impacts are forcing people to have to step out of their comfort zone more and more and say, hey, we've got to take action and do something because, my backyard is full of sand again. Yeah. So just, one thing people talk about, what is the potential for aquaculture as compared to wild harvest fisheries? And I just wanted to share that. So the orange line, the top line is kind of what wild harvest fisheries look like in total. Wild harvest for total wild harvest fisheries. And you can kind of see, I don't know if you can see if the numbers are showing up. Yeah. So, over the last 30 years, it's basically been flat how much we can take out of the ocean by fishing. So we just can't take any more. The blue line is how much is being produced by farming. So I just wanted to share that, there are ways to produce more food from the ocean sustainably with things like oysters that not only produce food, not only produce jobs, not only produce money, but have habitat benefits like what Steve and Pete were talking about. So you get so much more out of what you're producing than just food and money.
Do you think that this type of ocean farming, oyster farming, regenerative farming would ultimately replace wild harvest in the future, or will both always coexist?
No, I don't think it's going to replace, because I think wild harvest fisheries, for a lot of reasons, is going to stay. But the benefits that Steve and Pete were talking about, there's so many more benefits to shellfish aquaculture that come along with it, that's the kind of thing that we need to be thinking about, is not just the food, not just the money, but the ecosystem benefits that come along with it too.
Wonderful. Thank you all to the panelists. We are a little bit over time, but we also start a little bit late. So I do want to give the audience an opportunity to ask any burning questions if they have any. Otherwise, people will be able to talk to you all at the party afterwards. But does anybody have any questions? Colin?
Testing. It was kind of brought up earlier how oysters are say mounted to the floor, but I'm curious, if I had an oyster in my hand and a live oyster, what does its lifespan look like? Just thinking about the farming, the birthing, the regeneration process. Certainly we talked about how they mount, but just understanding end to end when you think of one oyster, let alone a billion oysters.
Yeah, I could take that one. Oysters they spend about 2 weeks in their larval stage, and then after their first year, they're old enough to begin reproducing. Oysters exhibit protandric hermaphroditism, which means that they're more likely to be male earlier in their lives, and as they develop the metabolic reserves to produce eggs, they transition into females. So a population of oysters needs to be 3-4 years old before it starts reproducing effectively. There's actually no natural senescence in oysters, so oysters can live for a very, very long time. But everything eats them and everything kills them. So the average lifespan for an oyster is really short. Most don't make it to their juvenile phase, and that's why an adult oyster can produce 25 million eggs, because almost all of them die. But they produce so many that the population can persist. And an old oyster for us in New York Harbor, 5-6-year-old oyster is an old oyster. I mean, and I think in general, seeing oysters that are more than 10 or 15 years old is pretty rare. But when colonists first arrived in New York City, they described finding oysters, they said the size of babies, but like multiple feet long, like oysters that are like this big. So they can live for a very long time.
When you collect oyster shells from various restaurants or however you populate the New York Harbor, how long do you have to keep them? Do you have to clean them? Do you do something to them? Do you have them like the middens you were talking about? Just pile them up for a long time to, I don't know, whatever they do. How long does that take to get them back in the water?
Yeah, so there are some really important biosecurity concerns with taking oyster shells that came out of the water all over the country in all 3 coasts, and some internationally, very few. But we get oysters, you can eat West Coast oysters in New York City restaurants. And so it's very important not to put those shells directly back into New York Harbor, because you can introduce organisms and pathogens from the West Coast into New York Harbor water. So all of our shells they first go to a shell depot in the Bronx, where they get put in these big roll-off containers. And then once a month, they come out to Governor's Island, and we lay them out in these huge piles. And they have to stay out of the water for more than a year. It's 6 months over 60 degrees, which in New York City is a year. And we have to turn the piles occasionally, and it's just through weathering, through the sun and rain, any pathogens and organisms perish. And then we actually clean them all. We put them through this tumbler to get any dust or anything else that's little bits of shell fragment off before they go in the tank. So by the time they go in our tanks, they've been out of the water for a year and cleaned.
Amazing work that you're all doing. I was wondering, have you ever been able to use the oysters? Sorry, has this project been successful enough so that you could turn contaminated water and using this oyster regeneration method to then eventually eat any of those oysters? Or what would be the timeline for that to be able to transpire?
We can start having that conversation as soon as we stop pouring raw sewage into New York Harbor. So the oysters do a great job cleaning the water. As long as we're putting sewage in the water, there will be sewage in the water, and no number of oysters will stop that from can clean that, right? In New York City, the water is swimmable and fishable most days of the year. It's safe to swim in. If it was a beach, it would be open. So the harbor is much cleaner than it's ever been. But every time it rains, our sewer system overflows and goes out into the harbor. And because of that, we can't eat the oysters. Because of that, New Yorkers are denied access to their biggest open space, most important natural resource, because it's contaminated with human waste, which I think we shouldn't stand for. But that's the reality. And as soon as that stops, as soon as we decide as a city that that's no longer acceptable and put the investment into the infrastructure in order to stop that from happening, then there's no reason why we couldn't have a conversation about eating oysters from New York Harbor. Me personally, I'm going to choose to eat my oysters from pristine environments far from the city.
So I know we're all dying to go and try an oyster, but I got one more. So the oyster is one species of oyster, is my understanding, or largely. And we're all led to believe that monocultures are a dangerous thing. So it's a 2-part question. The first part is, historically, was it always just one variety of oyster? And secondly, is that a problem? And should we be putting other kinds of oysters down there too?
Well, there's largely one species of oyster that's on the East Coast, that wraps around into the Gulf of Mexico, and there are a couple of different species on the West Coast. So there are a couple of different species, but
like that's the way it's always been, and there's just been one kind of oyster on the East Coast, as far as you know, before it was farmed and before it was farmed.
Yeah, but as far as a monoculture goes, what the reef does is it creates a habitat for lots of different other species that live on that reef. So it's like, if you think about a coral reef, it provides habitat for lots of different other animals.
So that has happened on the East Coast twice. 2 different parasites have killed virtually all the oysters on the East Coast at different times. But they historically all were the same species on the East Coast. On the West Coast, there's the one native species, and the other species have been introduced.
Globally, there are probably 7 or 8 that are commercially produced at any given time. And diversity in the family genetics kind of does differentiate oysters that you grow in Maine from the ones in Gulf of Mexico. They're the same species, but they kind of adapt to their different environments. I think with new technology, like the hatcheries are trying to breed in disease resistance and just more of a rich genetic sequence. So I think that might address future problems with disease and performance of these oysters. But the services are more or less the same across the species. We were going to do one and then maybe one more question, maybe, if everybody is two questions, and then we are going to eat and drink.
This will be a very quick answer. It seemed like from your graph of consumption for human, or capture human consumption and aquaculture, there's about a 50% difference between capture and human consumption. Where else do oysters go? What else is the use for? It was like 40 and then 60 something.
This is not just oysters. This is the orange line is wild harvest of all fish and shellfish, finfish and shellfish. So that's all wild harvest fish and shellfish is for all species. The difference between the orange and the green line, yes, would be for bait fish or for, yeah.
Hi, has there been any research on the ability of, say, healthy versus degraded oyster reefs in reducing wave energy, sort of as a reef? Like, they've done that with corals and mangroves to see how much they can be that coastal barrier. Maybe not.
Well, no, I was briefly distracted by my 3 children in the second row, so I missed part of the question. If you could just say it one more time, I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, of course. If there's any research on oyster reefs, maybe healthy versus degraded, in reduction of wave energy.
Yeah. So there's a lot of work in the Gulf of Mexico, in South Carolina, and a lot of the warmer states. Restored oyster reefs are installed specifically for that purpose. We're just starting to get our heads around that here in New York. We're involved in one project called the Living Breakwaters Project off of Staten Island, where oysters and oyster reefs are playing a critical role in a shoreline armament structure that's to protect from storm waves. Historically, in New York Harbor, oyster reefs played an enormous role in calming the water and protecting the shore from waves. Most of those reefs were old, thousands of years old, and it takes that time to grow. And so the new strategies to build oyster reefs for shoreline protection involve some man-made infrastructure and live oysters to give them that vertical relief off the bottom.
All right. Well, I want to thank all the panelists for contributing. And I believe we have some oysters to eat now.
Thank you.